Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he meticulously folded the napkin into a perfect triangle, placing it gently next to the gleaming silverware. It was a small task, insignificant perhaps to anyone else, but to Daniel, perfection in even these minor details was everything. His dark eyes, shadowed with exhaustion, glanced discreetly toward the ornate clock hanging prominently on the restaurant's mahogany-paneled wall. Only 5 more hours until closing, but the evening felt eternal. He straightened his posture as a wave of sophisticated laughter erupted from a nearby table. The prestigious downtown restaurant, aptly named Elegance, regularly hosted the city's elite, business magnates, celebrities, and powerful politicians. Daniel, invisible yet indispensable, navigated among them with practiced grace, his face a carefully maintained mask of courteous neutrality. "Daniel," whispered Amanda, another server and his only friend in this world of glamorous facades. Her voice carried a tinge of worry. "You look terrible. Did you sleep at all?" He forced a faint smile, brushing off the concern. "I'm fine. Just a late night, that's all." But Daniel was far from fine. Beneath the crisp white shirt and immaculate black apron, he carried burdens invisible to the patrons he served. The apartment he shared with his frail mother was humble, overcrowded with medical equipment whose costs were steadily devouring every paycheck. Every morning was a silent battle against bills piling up, eviction notices discreetly tucked beneath doormats, and doctors gently warning him of the bleak prospects ahead. As Daniel approached a table of distinguished guests, his anxiety spiked momentarily. The couple he was serving tonight were regulars, wealthy, demanding, and famously temperamental. "Your lobster bisque and duck confit, sir, madam," Daniel announced smoothly, expertly placing the plates with practiced precision. The woman waved him off dismissively without looking up. Daniel retreated silently, swallowing his pride, a small humiliation repeated a dozen times nightly, necessary for survival. Each hour passed in slow torment. The restaurant's golden glow and cheerful laughter stood in cruel contrast to Daniel's relentless worries. His every polite gesture, each courteous smile, was tinged with quiet desperation. Yet nobody noticed the subtle tremor of his fingers or the tired shadows beneath his eyes. Finally, when the last guests departed and the dining hall emptied, Daniel allowed himself a single sigh of relief, quickly masked as his supervisor, Mr. Warren, approached. "Excellent work tonight," Warren said dryly, glancing briefly at the meticulous setup Daniel had perfected. "You may go." "Thank you, sir," Daniel replied quietly, retrieving his coat from the employee locker room. The city night was bitterly cold, mirroring the hollow feeling gnawing at his chest. He tightened his scarf, stepping onto the dimly lit streets that stretched endlessly toward home, a journey that would offer no respite from the turmoil within. In his pocket, Daniel's phone buzzed insistently, a reminder of unpaid bills, overdue notices, and dwindling hopes. Each step echoed the silent struggle that no patron at Elegance ever glimpsed. But despite everything, Daniel's determination remained unbroken. He would return tomorrow, face the invisible battles again, for dignity had its price, and he was willing to pay it, no matter how steep. The evening air inside Elegance was thick with the fragrance of expensive perfumes, mingled with the subtle aroma of gourmet cuisine. Daniel moved deftly among tables, balancing trays laden with exquisite dishes as effortlessly as though they weighed nothing. Tonight, The restaurant buzzed louder than usual with anticipation. The rumor had spread quickly. Richard Callahan, the billionaire magnate known equally for his philanthropy and ruthless business acumen, was dining there with important business associates. Daniel had read about Richard Callahan in the news. Known publicly as generous and charitable, Richard privately maintained a reputation among restaurant workers as notoriously cold-hearted. Despite the apprehension swelling in his chest, Daniel prepared meticulously for the billionaire's arrival, determined to provide impeccable service that evening. The front door swung open dramatically, and Richard Callahan entered, exuding an aura of undeniable authority. The restaurant seemed momentarily hushed, conversations dwindling to whispers as heads turned discreetly. Richard strode confidently towards a central table already prepared for him, flanked by men and women clearly eager for his favor. Daniel swiftly approached the table, handing out menus with respectful efficiency. "Good evening, Mr. Callahan. Welcome back to Elegance. May I start you with our menu?" Richard glanced at Daniel briefly, his piercing eyes filled with indifference. "Just bring us whatever's most expensive," he replied curtly, turning immediately to his associates and resuming conversation without another glance. Throughout the meal, Daniel served Richard and his guests flawlessly, presenting dishes with practiced flair and anticipating every subtle need. Yet, no matter how carefully Daniel attended him, Richard made a point to ignore him, barely acknowledging his presence, as though Daniel was an inconvenient shadow rather than a person. At the end of the meal, Daniel presented the bill discreetly. Richard barely glanced at it before placing his sleek black card onto the tray, continuing his conversation without pause. Daniel processed the payment smoothly, returning promptly with the receipt. "Thank you for dining with us this evening, sir," Daniel said quietly, maintaining his composed dignity despite Richard's obvious disregard. Richard stood abruptly, casting a brief yet scathing look in Daniel's direction. His voice echoed clearly enough for surrounding tables to overhear. "Next time, train your staff better. The service tonight was utterly disappointing." He turned sharply, walking briskly toward the exit with his entourage following closely behind. Embarrassed, Daniel felt the eyes of patrons burning into his back. His face flushed with humiliation, heart racing painfully. He gathered the receipts, noticing immediately the glaring absence of any tip. His co-worker Amanda approached gently, placing a comforting hand briefly on his shoulder. "Daniel, ignore it. Everyone knows Richard Callahan treats everyone poorly." Daniel managed a weak nod, struggling to hide the hurt behind its practiced expression of neutrality. Inside, however, he felt crushed beneath the weight of humiliation, helplessness, and anger. As he finished cleaning the table, Daniel silently vowed to endure, yet somewhere deep inside, he felt the stirrings of defiance begin to take root. Beyond the glittering facade of wealth, Richard Callahan's life was one of hidden shadows and stark contrasts. Behind the fortified walls of his sprawling estate, away from the public eye that lauded his charitable contributions, Richard often retreated into isolation. Tonight was no different, as he sat alone in a dimly lit study, surrounded by opulence, yet enveloped in solitude. On his antique desk lay stacks of financial reports, countless letters of gratitude from institutions he'd donated to, and framed photos documenting moments of apparent triumph. But none of these items brought him any comfort. Richard's cold eyes drifted aimlessly until they rested upon a faded photograph tucked discreetly inside a gilded frame, a picture of himself as a young boy, face smudged with dirt, eyes haunted by desperation, a painful reminder of where he came from. Richard's memories surged unbidden, carrying him back to a tiny, dilapidated apartment overshadowed by poverty and abuse. His father, a cruel, relentless figure whose voice still echoed in his mind, belittled and brutalized him regularly. Worthless, his father's voice mocked from the recesses of his memory, fueling Richard's deep-seated contempt for weakness, poverty, and vulnerability. In those formative years, Richard learned a harsh truth. Power and money brought respect, while vulnerability attracted nothing but cruelty. Driven by those scars, he vowed never to be weak again. His climb from desperate poverty to billionaire status was ruthless, marked by calculated decisions that left little room for mercy or compassion. Across town, Daniel faced his own torment. The narrow staircase creaked beneath him as he climbed wearily to his modest apartment, tucked away in a building worn thin by time. Opening the door softly, he slipped inside, greeted immediately by the rhythmic beeping of medical monitors. His mother lay in a small bed near the window, her frail frame illuminated by soft moonlight filtering through threadbare curtains. "Daniel?" Her voice, weak yet filled with unconditional love, stirred him. "I'm here, Mom," Daniel whispered reassuringly, moving quickly to her bedside. He took her delicate hand in his own, squeezing gently, masking the exhaustion from his voice. "How are you feeling?" She smiled weakly, her eyes bright despite her obvious pain. "Better now that you're home. Did you eat?" Daniel forced a gentle smile. "Yes, Mom. They feed us at work. Don't worry." She nodded slowly, drifting again toward sleep, comforted by his presence. Daniel watched her breathing softly, each rise and fall of her chest a precious miracle amidst their relentless struggle. Quietly, he retrieved a stack of unopened bills hidden in a drawer, scanning them with growing dread. Medical debts, utility notices, threats of eviction, all painted a harsh portrait of an impending collapse. He closed his eyes tightly, struggling to contain his desperation. Richard Callahan's face flashed vividly in his mind, the billionaire's harsh words, the blatant humiliation. Yet beneath his anger was a growing curiosity. What twisted the heart of someone so outwardly successful into something so bitter and cold? Daniel realized that Richard was a man shackled by his own past, trapped behind walls he'd built himself, walls thicker and colder than Daniel's modest apartment. As sleep eventually claimed him, Daniel resolved to confront his struggles head-on. Little did he know their lives were destined to intersect again, bound together by unseen forces, pulling them both inexorably toward change. The days following the humiliating encounter with Richard Callahan passed in a blur of tension and exhaustion for Daniel. He returned to Elegance each night, performing his duties with practiced efficiency, yet each interaction grew heavier, laden with quiet anger and fatigue. Thoughts of Richard's public scorn haunted him, festering within until they threatened to erupt. One rainy evening, after enduring yet another demanding shift, Daniel spotted Richard Callahan again. He sat surrounded by business associates, laughing heartily, oblivious to the workers around him. Daniel, his patience worn paper-thin, dutifully approached the table with a wine decanter. His hands trembled slightly, betraying his suppressed anger. Richard caught the faint tremor, his gaze narrowing sharply. "Careful!" he drawled, voice dripping disdain, loud enough for surrounding tables to hear. "Perhaps a simpler job might suit you better." Laughter erupted around him, intensifying Daniel's humiliation. Daniel's vision blurred momentarily, a hot wave of rage overwhelming him. His grip tightened dangerously around the decanter, but he forced himself to step away without incident. The humiliation burned hot in his chest, mingling with desperation and the relentless pressures of mounting debts at home. Hours later, as Daniel clocked out, he was gripped by a sudden, reckless impulse. Rain hammered the pavement relentlessly as he exited the restaurant, pulling his coat tightly around himself. His feet carried him almost unconsciously toward Richard Callahan's estate, driven by a desperate need for confrontation, for justice, anything to reclaim his shattered dignity. Approaching the gated entrance, Daniel hesitated, drenched and trembling, not just from the cold, but from the enormity of what he was about to do. Silently, he slipped through a gap in the hedges, cautiously moving closer to the expansive, lonely mansion. Peering through a dimly lit window, Daniel expected to see the ruthless billionaire he despised, exuding his usual arrogance. Instead, he witnessed a startling scene. Richard Callahan slumped in a chair, visibly frail and vulnerable, coughing violently into a handkerchief stained ominously with blood. The billionaire's expression was haunted, filled with deep loneliness and regret, a stark contrast to the cold facade he presented to the world. Daniel froze, stunned by this unexpected revelation. His anger faltered, replaced by confusion and an unsettling surge of empathy. Richard Callahan, the man who had tormented him, appeared suddenly human, fragile, isolated, and profoundly ill. Confrontation forgotten, Daniel stepped back quietly, heart racing with conflicted emotions. He'd glimpsed a truth beneath Richard's facade, revealing a shared vulnerability neither man could ignore. As he walked slowly away from the mansion, Daniel realized that the path ahead had irrevocably shifted, steering him toward a choice he had never anticipated making. The days following the humiliating encounter with Richard Callahan passed in a blur of tension and exhaustion for Daniel. He returned to Elegance each night, performing his duties with practiced efficiency, yet each interaction grew heavier, laden with quiet anger and fatigue. Thoughts of Richard's public scorn haunted him, festering within until they threatened to erupt. One rainy evening, after enduring yet another demanding shift, Daniel spotted Richard Callahan again. He sat surrounded by business associates, laughing heartily, oblivious to the workers around him. Daniel, his patience worn paper thin, his hands trembled slightly, betraying his suppressed anger. Richard caught the faint tremor, his gaze narrowing sharply. "Careful," he drawled, voice dripping disdain, loud enough for surrounding tables to hear. "Perhaps a simpler job might suit you better." Laughter erupted around him, intensifying Daniel's humiliation. Daniel's vision blurred momentarily, a hot wave of rage overwhelming him. He forced himself to step away without incident. The humiliation burned hot in his chest, mingling with desperation and the relentless pressures of mounting debts at home. Hours later, as Daniel clocked out, he was gripped by a sudden, reckless impulse. Rain hammered the pavement relentlessly as he exited the restaurant, pulling his coat tightly around himself. His feet carried him almost unconsciously toward Richard Callahan's estate, driven by a desperate need for confrontation, for justice, anything to reclaim his shattered dignity. Approaching the gated entrance, Daniel hesitated, drenched and trembling, not just from the cold, but from the enormity of what he was about to do. Silently, he slipped through a gap in the hedges, cautiously moving closer to the expansive, lonely mansion. Peering through a dimly lit window, Daniel expected to see the ruthless billionaire he despised, exuding his usual arrogance. Instead, he witnessed a startling scene. Richard Callahan slumped in a chair, visibly frail and vulnerable, coughing violently into a handkerchief stained ominously with blood. The billionaire's expression was haunted, filled with deep loneliness and regret, a stark contrast to the cold facade he presented to the world. Daniel froze, stunned by this unexpected revelation. His anger faltered, replaced by confusion and an unsettling surge of empathy. Richard Callahan, the man who had tormented him, appeared suddenly human, fragile, isolated, and profoundly ill. Confrontation forgotten, Daniel stepped back quietly, heart racing with conflicted emotions. He'd glimpsed a truth beneath Richard's facade, revealing a shared vulnerability neither man could ignore. As he walked slowly away from the mansion, Daniel realized that the path ahead had irrevocably shifted, steering him toward a choice he had never anticipated making. Days passed, yet the memory of Richard Callahan's hidden suffering continued to haunt Daniel, reshaping his anger into something far more complex. Each shift at Elegance became increasingly difficult as Daniel struggled to reconcile the image of the ruthless billionaire he knew publicly with the vulnerable, sickly man he'd seen that rainy night. Late one evening, compelled by a mix of curiosity and compassion he couldn't ignore, Daniel returned quietly to Richard's mansion, this time driven by a different kind of impulse. Under the cover of darkness, he left an envelope containing carefully selected herbal remedies, a gentle handwritten note, and a small comforting book about coping with illness. Returning home, Daniel felt a strange blend of relief and anxiety. He had little to offer, his resources already stretched thin by his mother's care, yet this anonymous gesture felt necessary, right even. Perhaps kindness was all he truly had left to give. Over the coming days, Daniel continued these quiet, anonymous acts, small offerings of comfort left discreetly at Richard's doorstep. Carefully brewed teas, nourishing soups, and heartfelt notes of encouragement. Each gift was modest, yet filled with genuine care, gradually softening Richard's hardened exterior. Richard Callahan, initially suspicious and bewildered by these mysterious acts, slowly began to find solace in their quiet warmth. Each anonymous kindness chipped away at his defenses, stirring emotions long buried beneath pride and bitterness. For the first time in years, Richard experienced the simple comfort of knowing someone genuinely cared, even if the identity remained hidden. Daniel, in turn, found his own spirit renewed. Despite his exhausting days and relentless struggles, the secret acts of compassion filled him with newfound purpose, reminding him of the strength inherent in kindness, even toward those who had hurt him deeply. Yet neither Daniel nor Richard knew how dramatically their intertwined paths were about to collide, forever altering both their lives in ways neither had imagined. The mysterious acts of kindness left Richard Callahan deeply moved and increasingly curious. Each morning, he found himself eagerly checking for new gifts, each one more thoughtful than the last. The anonymous gestures had awakened something within him, a longing to connect, to acknowledge the humanity he had long suppressed. Determined to uncover the identity of his anonymous benefactor, Richard discreetly installed surveillance cameras around his property. It wasn't long before the cameras captured a familiar figure, Daniel, the waiter he had so callously humiliated, quietly leaving yet another package at his doorstep. Seeing Daniel's face, Richard felt an immediate and overwhelming sense of guilt and shame. Memories flooded back, each harsh word, every humiliating moment he had inflicted upon Daniel. Driven by remorse and a desire for redemption, Richard decided to visit Daniel's modest home, determined to apologize and make amends. Late one evening, Richard stood nervously outside Daniel's small apartment, clutching a handwritten apology. As the door opened slowly, Richard was struck by the humble surroundings. The dimly lit room crowded with medical equipment, the tired figure of Daniel's mother resting quietly in her bed, and Daniel's startled, questioning eyes. I came to apologize," Richard stammered softly, his voice heavy with regret. He stepped cautiously inside, offering Daniel the heartfelt letter he had written. "I've treated you terribly, Daniel. You deserved none of it, and yet you've shown me only kindness in return. I didn't know your struggles, didn't understand your sacrifices." Daniel hesitated, then quietly accepted the letter, sensing sincerity in Richard's trembling voice. As Richard observed firsthand the harsh reality Daniel faced daily, his heart broke anew, shattering the remnants of his pride. Overwhelmed, Richard sat beside Daniel, his eyes filled with tears of genuine remorse. "I want to help you, Daniel, not just repay your kindness, but truly help change your life. Please let me make this right." In the quiet intensity of that moment, barriers dissolved, replaced by mutual understanding and forgiveness. Both men knew their lives were now bound by more than circumstance, connected forever through acts of compassion, vulnerability, and an extraordinary journey toward redemption. Richard Callahan knew his time was limited, a fact that weighed heavily on him as he reflected on his life's decisions. With each passing day, the billionaire became increasingly determined to use what remained of his wealth and influence to make amends, not just with Daniel, but with all those he had unknowingly or deliberately overlooked. The city buzzed with curiosity when Richard called a press conference, something he rarely did. Reporters, associates, and members of the public gathered, eager to hear the billionaire's unexpected announcement. Standing at the podium, visibly frail yet resolute, Richard spoke with sincerity that surprised everyone. "Many of you know me as a successful businessman and philanthropist," Richard began, his voice carrying clearly despite its underlying fragility. "But behind closed doors, I've often failed to uphold the values I publicly championed. I've mistreated people, judged harshly, and neglected compassion. Recently, one person opened my eyes and showed me the profound power of kindness and humility." Pausing briefly, Richard's gaze settled warmly on Daniel, who stood quietly at the side, a modest, somewhat embarrassed smile on his face. Richard continued, emotion swelling in his voice. "Daniel, this man who I once humiliated repaid my cruelty with care, compassion, and friendship. He reminded me that true wealth isn't measured by fortune or status, but by the impact we leave on others. I am dedicating my remaining days and resources to ensure that others won't endure unnecessary struggles as Daniel and his mother have. From today forward, my foundation will focus entirely on supporting those who silently battle life's hardships every day, unsung heroes whose courage and resilience often go unnoticed." The room erupted in applause, cameras flashing rapidly, capturing the powerful moment. Daniel stood quietly, humbled yet proud, tears of gratitude welling in his eyes. Over the weeks that followed, Richard poured himself wholeheartedly into transforming lives, ensuring Daniel and his mother were secure, comfortable, and hopeful for the first time in years. The community experienced a profound shift, influenced by Richard's heartfelt initiative, fostering empathy and generosity throughout the city. On a quiet morning, as sunlight softly illuminated his peaceful face, Richard Callahan passed away, leaving behind a lasting legacy defined by redemption, compassion, and meaningful change. Found gently clasped in his hand was Daniel's letter, a poignant testament to the transformative power of kindness, a final silent message that wealth's greatest value is measured not by what one accumulates, but by what one gives away.